my daughter, Emma, and I stood at the front window, watching as my wife, Melissa, shamelessly loaded her suitcases into Ethan's car. It was a Sunday morning, and Ethan, with a smug, self-satisfied grin, had shown up to pick her up under the pretense of a business trip. They claimed they were flying to New York that evening for meetings ahead of some mediation, but I knew better. Melissa's little charade was as transparent as glass. Melissa still had her looks at 44, slim, curvy, with striking emerald eyes and a mane of jet black hair. She'd gained a little weight over the years, but nothing that diminished her appeal. That's why she thought she could still play games like this. We got married right after high school, and I worked myself to the bone to put her through university while earning my own degree online. Once she finished law school, we moved back home to raise our family, but it was always my effort holding everything together. Now, after 25 years of marriage, this is what I get. A wife who thinks she's clever enough to run around with her boss like I'm too stupid to notice. I could see the excitement in her eyes as she said goodbye. Melissa thought she was heading off on some thrilling adventure, but what she didn't know was that her little house of cards was about to collapse. I'd already been tipped off. Deborah, Ethan's wife, had called me out of the blue. She wasn't some meek woman. She was angry, focused, and ready to take her husband down. She told me about his string of affairs with subordinates and warned me that Melissa was just the latest addition to his collection. Together, Deborah and her father had set a trap, and I was ready to watch it all unfold. When Ethan refused my offer to drive them to the airport, claiming it was more convenient to take his car, it only confirmed what I already knew. He couldn't risk me overhearing their private conversations. I let them leave without a word, but not because I was weak. I wanted them to think they were safe, that their plan was airtight. Standing on the porch, I waved like everything was fine, knowing full well their fantasy would soon crash and burn. Melissa's promotion to associate partner 2 years ago had gone straight to her head. The power, the money, it all made her arrogant, reckless. She thought she was untouchable, but she was wrong. She always underestimated me, and that's where she made her biggest mistake. After Ethan's car disappeared down the street, Emma turned to me, her expression guarded. "Does Mom have any idea that we know?" she asked. "That she's just another one of Ethan's conquests?" "Not a chance," I replied firmly. "Your mother's always had a blind spot for the truth. She thinks she's smarter than everyone else, but all she's doing is walking straight into a trap. Why didn't you stop her if you knew?" Emma pressed. "Because your mom doesn't listen," I said, my voice sharp. "If I told her to stay away from Ethan, she'd call me controlling or jealous. She'd turn it into a fight, just like she always does. No, Emma, some lessons need to be learned the hard way." Emma frowned. "Does his wife know?" "She knows everything," I replied coldly. "And so does her father. They're done covering for Ethan. This isn't his first affair, but it will be his last. Deborah's ready to end her marriage, and I'm ready to end mine. Melissa has no idea what's coming." Emma hesitated. "Will you forgive her?" "Not this time," I said flatly. "I gave her one chance years ago, and that was more than she deserved. This time, she's done. She packed her bags, and now she can deal with the consequences." Emma's eyes widened at my bluntness, but she didn't argue. She was starting to understand the kind of person her mother really was. "Dad, I don't get it," she said quietly. "Why did you forgive her before?" I looked her in the eye. "You were too young to know this before, but now you need to hear it. Before you were born, your mother cheated. She was already pregnant when I found out. I was ready to leave, but a paternity test confirmed you were mine. That's the only reason I stayed." Emma's jaw dropped. "Who was it?" she asked hesitantly. "Do I know him?" "You do," I said, my tone icy. "You've called him Uncle Victor your whole life." Emma froze, the realization dawning on her. The reason I always avoided Victor, the split family holidays, my unwillingness to be in the same room with him, it all made sense now. "Maybe you should text your uncle," I said with a grim smile. "Tell him where Melissa is staying. I'm sure he'd love to reconnect." I walked into the kitchen, leaving Emma to process everything. I grabbed a cup of coffee and flipped through the local paper, looking for rental listings. With Emma heading off to university soon, Melissa had no reason to stay. Once the truth came out, she could take her fantasy life and find somewhere else to live. I knew I needed to act quickly before Melissa returned. Judge McDonald, who typically prioritized children's needs, was known for leaving parents frustrated. I wasn't about to let that happen. The house wouldn't be hers for long, not after everything she'd done. Emma's phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. She spoke in hushed tones for a while before turning to me. Uncle Victor confessed, she said. He's sorry about everything and wants to talk to you. It had been 18 years since I last heard from my brother. Maybe it was time to hear what he had to say, though I wasn't expecting much. Melissa's actions had forced me to reassess everything, including the past. Back then, I stayed in the marriage for the sake of the kids, unwilling to let them grow up in a broken home. But now, that obligation was long gone. Grabbing a bottle of Jack Daniels, I told Emma to drive me. Victor was waiting at our old fishing spot, a place that held too many memories. When I arrived, he was already there, standing awkwardly by a small fire. We passed the bottle between us, and he began recounting his version of events. His story contradicted Melissa's, though I figured the truth lay somewhere in the middle. In the end, the details didn't matter anymore. What did matter was that Victor took responsibility for his actions. For once, he wasn't trying to weasel his way out of it. Still, my anger toward Melissa only grew. Victor, as much as he'd been involved, had always been more of a follower than a leader. He wasn't the mastermind here. That blame belonged squarely on my wife. As the alcohol started to kick in, our father found us. Spotting the fire from a distance, he must have thought we were local teens causing trouble. He approached with a shotgun in hand, ready to chase us off his property. Once he realized it was us, he grumbled about our stupidity and drove us back to the farmhouse in Victor's truck. Mom was already awake, cooking eggs and potatoes like she used to when we were kids. She didn't say much, but her disapproval was clear. As we sat around the table eating, Mom called Emma and Victor's wife, Mary, to come over. By the time they arrived, we were sobering up, though the hangover was starting to creep in. Mary looked stunned to see Victor and me sitting together. "Okay, so you're reconciled," Mary said, crossing her arms. "After all this time, we deserve to know what caused the split." I opened my mouth to speak, but Victor nudged me, a silent signal from our childhood. He'd always been better at spinning stories to get us out of trouble. This time, though, I misjudged him. Instead of covering for himself, he laid it all bare. "Melissa and I had an affair," he admitted, his voice steady. "It was during her pregnancy with Emma. It was my fault. I was young and stupid. My brother caught us, and since then, I've been dead to him." The weight of his confession hung in the air. Dad's face darkened, and he muttered, "Damn, if I were Clinton, I'd have eliminated you." Mom shook her head, her disappointment palpable. "What made you confess now?" she asked. "Melissa flew to New York with her boss," I said, my tone bitter. "They only booked one hotel room for the trip. Deborah, Ethan's wife, hired private investigators to catch them in the act. Emma knows about their plans, and now she understands why I've taken the steps I have." Emma, seated across from me, looked determined. "I should have let you confront him, Dad," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Mom deserves it." "Too late for that now," I said flatly. "Melissa's going to face the consequences, and when she does, she won't have this house to fall back on. I'll make sure of it." "Dad, I'm not staying with Mom," Emma said firmly. "Where you go, I go. We're sticking together." Her resolute tone matched mine, and I nodded. At least I wasn't fighting this battle alone. When Mom suggested we move in temporarily, I agreed without hesitation. We'd only take what we needed, clothes, a few essentials, and leave the rest behind. Melissa could deal with the leftovers. By Monday night, we began slowly moving out, taking our favorite belongings: the TV, my rocking chair, Emma's makeup table. Melissa kept texting updates about her progress in New York, completely unaware of the storm brewing back home. On Thursday, Deborah suggested we meet at Logan's Roadhouse. I agreed and arrived at 8 p.m., spotting her easily by her white scarf. Deborah was striking, far younger than I expected, blonde hair, soft blue eyes, and a graceful presence that exuded confidence. She mentioned being a kindergarten teacher, which explained her conservative dress. In contrast, I'd shown up in my work clothes from the nursing home where I managed HR. Over dinner, she confirmed the investigators had everything they needed. Ethan and Melissa would be served with legal papers as soon as they returned. Deborah asked how I was holding up, and I told her bluntly, this time's easier. Last time, I didn't see it coming. This time, I'm prepared. She listened as I recounted the night Victor and I had reconciled, chuckling at my description of Dad catching us like kids sneaking out. Parents have a way of making everything feel like home, she said, smiling. After dinner, we ended up at a nearby bar, dancing and laughing like we didn't have the weight of betrayal hanging over us. For the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. When I got home, Emma immediately teased me. Daddy's got a new girlfriend, she joked, smirking. I laughed, shaking my head. Not a chance, kiddo. The next morning, as we prepared for the day, Emma wouldn't let up. Her teasing felt like a reminder that we'd survived worse. That night, Mom cooked dinner, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were a family again. The next morning, while I sorted through the day's tasks, a text popped up from an unfamiliar number. It was supposedly from Mom, asking me to call her. That was my first clue something was off. It was likely Michael's number. I ignored it, filing it mentally under irrelevant distractions. When I mentioned it to Emma, she smirked. They're probably at the house right now, wondering where we are, she said. I left Mom a note suggesting she make Michael move out, since his wife already kicked him to the curb. Think she'll confess to the boys? Not a chance, I replied. Melissa would rather bite her tongue off than admit the truth. She's probably banking on them staying in the dark. Let's ditch our phones for the day, Emma suggested. That way, if the boys want answers, they'll have to go through Mom. Might as well keep them on their toes. It was a solid plan, so we did just that. While we enjoyed a peaceful, quiet evening, chaos brewed elsewhere. As I learned later, my sons had indeed gone to the old house. Finding my favorite chair missing and discovering Emma's note in the kitchen, they pieced together that we'd moved out. Their calls to us went unanswered, and Melissa played dumb, pretending not to know what was happening. Frustrated and out of options, they turned to Uncle Victor, who hinted, without giving much away, that I probably didn't want to be found. The next day, the news of our split spread faster than wildfire. By the time I wrapped up my workday, my secretary patched through a call from Jake, my eldest. He wasted no time getting to the point. What's going on, Dad? Where are you and Emma living now? He asked. I kept my response blunt. Check your texts. I just sent you something that'll answer all your questions. Forward it to Jason if you want. If you need more answers, come to Grandpa's after dinner. I ended the call without further explanation, sending him the video Deborah had shared. Within 10 minutes, Jake responded with a simple wow. True to his word, he arrived at my parents' place later that evening. As the family gathered, my parents quietly excused themselves, giving us the space to talk. Jake and Jason tried to soften the situation, urging me to forgive Melissa and move on. Dad, everyone makes mistakes, Jake said. You forgave us countless times when we were kids. Can't you do the same for Mom? That was enough to set Emma off. You two are complete idiots, she snapped, her voice dripping with anger. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some accident. Mom and Michael planned this down to the last detail. They booked that hotel room as Mr. and Mrs. Truscott a week before they even left. They knew exactly what they were doing. I watched my sons' faces shift as the reality sank in. We watched Mom leave that Sunday, Emma continued, her voice sharp. She wasn't just cheating, she was flaunting it. Dad offered to drive her to the airport, but no, she wanted Michael to pick her up so she could make a show of it. She didn't even care that we knew. That's how little respect she has for this family. Taking a deep breath, I added my own thoughts. Your mother didn't just betray me, she betrayed all of us. This wasn't some slip-up. It was deliberate, and it's not the first time. I'm seeing a doctor tomorrow to get tested for STDs. I can't trust that Melissa didn't have other lovers during all those business trips. The room fell silent as my words hung in the air. Jason finally broke it, his voice defensive. Dad, you can't be serious. Mom wouldn't do that. Can we trust her to tell the truth? I challenged. Because I can't. And until I have facts, I'm not taking any chances. With that, I excused myself to grab a coffee, leaving them to sit with the weight of what they'd learned. My father caught me on the way back, his voice steady. You're handling this the right way, Clint. Considering her job and the constant travel, It's more than plausible she's had other partners. It's smart to get tested. Even if she had separate numbers, she could have kept things hidden, I added. There's no point trusting someone who lies for a living. As my phone rang, I stepped out onto the veranda to take the call. It was Deborah. What's going on? I asked. Michael doesn't get it, she said with a sigh. He thinks I should forgive him and move on, but I made it clear I don't want him around our daughter. That's when it finally hit him. He's not in control anymore. He's completely blind to the damage he's caused. Melissa's the same, I replied. She doesn't realize how much she's lost. I've already blocked her number, and so has Emma. I forwarded her the video to make it crystal clear that we're done. Deborah laughed bitterly. That must have been a wake-up call. It was I said. She knows we're aware now. It must be killing her to lose control. Deborah updated me on Michael's situation. I told him his stuff's in the garage until he picks it up. He's still reeling, trying to figure out what went wrong. Well, I said, my voice firm. He'll have plenty of time to reflect alone. After hanging up, I leaned against the railing, letting the night air cool my thoughts. The pieces were falling into place, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. Melissa and Michael could stew in the mess they'd made while I moved forward, stronger than ever. The next step was obvious. Change the locks. It wasn't just a precaution, it was a statement. Let Michael or Melissa try to weasel their way back into the house. It would send a message loud and clear that their time here was done. That night, I sat down with my kids for another candid conversation. I'm getting tested, I told them directly, because I need answers your mother won't give me. Do any of you honestly believe she'd confess if there were others? Their silence was answer enough. Emma looked disgusted. Jake and Jason looked uncomfortable, but no one dared to argue. After we wrapped up, I wished them all good night and headed to the kitchen. When I walked in, their eyes locked on me, as if they were waiting for me to say something definitive. I'm taking tomorrow off, I announced. I've got a lawyer's appointment at 9 a.m. Those two are going to be served with lawsuits the second they touch down on Thursday. Jake's eyes welled with tears, finally understanding just how serious this was. Before I could say anything, my father spoke, his tone sharp. Michael might not be the first, but he damn well better be the last. I would have handled that first one very differently. That's not true, Jason protested. Mom denied everything until we showed her the video. My mother, sitting quietly until now, cut him off. You're clueless, she said, her voice cold. Have you ever wondered why your father didn't speak to Uncle Victor for 18 years? They patched things up Sunday night because Victor finally confessed. He admitted Clint didn't deserve what happened, but it still took him this long to take responsibility. Julie, sitting beside her grandmother, added, Victor told Dad everything, including that it was his fault. He knew it, and so did Dad. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the room. As I put the kettle on, my kids sat silently, each processing their mother's betrayal in their own way. Their reactions in the coming days would define their relationships with her. The boys decided to head home for the night, leaving me alone with Julie upstairs and the kettle still boiling. It was a rare moment of peace, and I seized the opportunity for a private conversation with my parents. Mom was the first to speak. They're watching you, she warned. How you handle this will guide them. I know, I replied. I'll stay composed and let the lawyers do their job. The past is unchangeable, and I won't let it control me anymore. Dad nodded approvingly. Some might see this as your last chance to make a statement. Maybe, I conceded, but Melissa's not worth risking jail time. This ends with a courtroom, not a confrontation. Hearing that, my father smiled with pride. You're a better man than I was, Clint. Your mother and I raised you well. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. As I laid out the timeline of events leading up to that meeting, her interest piqued when I mentioned Melissa's employer. Did you know I used to work there? She asked. They've got a strict code of ethics. If I still have my old documents, we could sue the firm alongside them. I leaned back in my chair. What would we gain? Not much beyond legal fees, she admitted, but it would make life hell for them. Let's see what we can dig up. Her name was Brenda Ferguson, and she was as sharp as they came. I agreed to her plan. Their earliest flight back is Thursday morning out of St. Louis. I I told her as I handed over her retainer fee. I want them served the moment they land. As I left her office, I couldn't help but feel like David staring down Goliath. Melissa's company was massive, the largest in the area, with 4 separate divisions. But David didn't need size, just precision. Later that day, I stopped by my family doctor to request STD tests. His brow furrowed in surprise, but he agreed without hesitation. When I left, I had no idea Jake had already informed Melissa of my decision. My son, candid as ever, told her flat out, "After Uncle Victor and Michael, Dad doesn't trust you." Honestly, neither do we. Melissa predictably spun it as me being paranoid. Jake, however, wasn't buying it. "Mom, just let it go. This is on you." Meanwhile, Brenda wasn't wasting any time. By Thursday morning, Melissa's firm was already facing fines. My attorney had filed a $10 million lawsuit, claiming the dismissal of one of the partners amounted to an admission of guilt. When Melissa and Michael landed, they were met with legal papers. She took a taxi home alone, looking every bit the outcast she'd become. A call from the doctor confirmed what I'd feared, a mild STD. It wasn't serious, but it required reporting. That meant Melissa would have to disclose her full history. By 6 p.m., the lawsuit had made the news, exposing both of them. I texted Emma during her evening class to let her know. She replied immediately, spreading the word to her brothers. That night, I had dinner with Deborah at Red Lobster. When she arrived, she greeted me warmly. "You're becoming quite the rock star," she joked. "My dad can't stop talking about how you're handling this." "Tell him to save the praise," I said with a grin. "We're just getting started." As we ate, Deborah handed me an envelope. Inside were statements from 5 of Michael's former subordinates. Each one detailed how he'd coerced them into favors. My lawyer's case had just gotten a massive boost. When I got home close to midnight, I found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face. Wordlessly, I made her a cup of tea and sat down beside her. "It's okay to cry," I said softly. "You've been holding it together for everyone else. Let it out." She leaned into me, sobbing as I held her tightly. It was the first time in weeks I'd seen her let her guard down. By the time we finished our tea, she'd regained her composure. "Dinner with Deborah went well?" she asked, a hint of a smile breaking through. "It did," I said. "We're starting to form a real friendship." Emma nodded, satisfied. "Good. You deserve that." Melissa had clearly started to feel the weight of her decisions. She tried messaging me and Emma, likely hoping to delay the inevitable. Maybe she thought I'd calm down and we could talk it out. But Jake's earlier words must have echoed in her mind, because no amount of messaging would undo the damage. Her choices had exposed her for what she was, and now she was stuck facing the consequences. When she found a letter from the county health department in the mail detailing my STD diagnosis, Melissa finally cracked. Breaking down in tears, she seemed to realize the nightmare wasn't going to end anytime soon. Worse, she must have known that this discovery would only add fuel to the fire, that it wasn't just about Michael. Past business trips now loomed suspiciously, forcing everyone to question how long her betrayals had truly spanned. Meanwhile, Michael Truscott was drowning his sorrows in a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. Louise filing for divorce had hit him hard, though not nearly as hard as what was coming next. Too absorbed in his pity to notice the man sitting down beside him, he was caught off guard when a fight broke out nearby. Amidst the chaos, Michael was punched squarely in the face, 3 times, in fact. The words the assailant yelled carried a familiar ring of my resentment. Justice for his actions. Michael was too dazed to retaliate, left bleeding and stunned in the aftermath. On my end, I had a different fight to resolve, my ongoing conversation with Jake. One Saturday afternoon, while tending to chores in my father's barn, Jake's stubbornness reached a boiling point. He'd been consoling Melissa and now thought it was his duty to convince me to take her back. "Do it for the family," he insisted. "For everyone's peace." I let him talk, his words pouring out in a stream of emotional reasoning. Once he'd said his piece, I stepped in with a pointed question. "Jake, imagine you're married. You find out your wife's been unfaithful. Would you still offer the same advice?" His silence told me everything I needed to know, but I wasn't about to let it slide. You're suggesting I accept being with someone who repeatedly disrespected me. Do you see me as insignificant? Someone to be walked over? Jake's stunned expression said it all. My voice hardened. If you can't respect my decisions, don't bother coming back. I left him there, reeling, to think about his words. Later, seeking clarity, he turned to Uncle Victor for advice. Victor, to his credit, didn't mince words. Jake, your mother pursued me, he admitted. I fell for it, and it destroyed my relationship with your father for 18 years. I've had to live with that regret every day. Your dad's right. Melissa didn't get that STD from Michael. She brought it home, plain and simple. And by doing that, she showed how little she thought of your father. Victor's voice grew sharp. This isn't about forgiveness. It's about respect. Your dad did everything for your family, and this was her way of rewarding him? If you don't fix this, you'll lose him forever. Victor's words seemed to stick, and Jake didn't argue again. Monday morning brought its own victories. Brenda Ferguson informed me that Melissa and Michael's firm had dropped my lawsuit. They were back in good standing, praised for their recent settlements. But Michael wasn't off the hook entirely. He was still nursing his wounds from the bar brawl. His bruised face became the talk of the office, and when he shared the story with Melissa, she could barely contain her frustration. That afternoon, I found Melissa waiting by my car, looking exhausted and defeated. Her appearance didn't soften my stance. Back off, she snapped as I approached. Michael's dealing with enough thanks to your little revenge stunt. I crossed my arms, feigning ignorance. I have no idea what you're talking about. She scowled. He got attacked in a bar. The guy said he was your friend and kept shouting about us. I couldn't help but laugh. It was the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. If I knew who did it, I'd buy them a whiskey, I said. Your lover got off easy. If it had been me, he'd be dead. As Melissa's face twisted in disbelief, my phone buzzed. It was Louise, her message marked urgent. I glanced at it briefly before replying. I'm on my way. You're colder than I've ever seen you, Melissa muttered. Enough. Get your lawyer and finalize this divorce. I snapped. Without waiting for her response, I got into my car and drove off, done with her lies and manipulations. When I arrived at Louise's house, she was visibly upset. What's wrong? I asked, stepping out of the car. It's about Michael, she said. Your dad's friend had him punched in a bar. He used your name. My grin was involuntary and immediate. That's the best news I've heard all week, I said. If I knew where he lived, I'd send a thank you whiskey. Louise finally cracked a smile, her tension easing. She hugged me briefly, and I felt a surprising warmth in her embrace. Before I could apologize for the moment, she kissed me lightly on the cheek. It wasn't romantic. It was mutual understanding, a shared bond in the chaos. They're both inside, she said, stepping back. They want to talk to you. She led me into the house, her daughters peeking out shyly from a bedroom. I winked at them, earning giggles in return. Louise's father greeted me, his large frame imposing, but his demeanor warm. If I were your age, I'd send you a bottle of whiskey myself, I said, shaking his hand. He laughed. Think before doing anything foolish, he advised. My dad saved me a lot of trouble at your age with that same advice. We exchanged formalities before he left, leaving me with Louise and her daughters. Livia and Lori were bright, curious, and full of energy. They told me about their favorite restaurant, a pizza place called Zitzi's. Would you let me treat you and your mom to dinner there? I asked, crouching to their level. Their enthusiastic yes was all the answer I needed. Let me call my mom and tell her I won't be home for dinner. I told them, dialing while they watched with curiosity. They found the exchange amusing and were eager to head out. At Zitzi's, the girls dashed ahead, leaving Louise and me to settle at the table. When one of her colleagues spotted us, her daughter asked, Are you Mom's boyfriend? I'm just her friend, I said, amused but cautious. Did you go on a date? Livia pressed. Not yet, I replied with a smile. But I'd need permission from someone very special. I teased, who? Lori's eyes twinkled as she asked. Who needs to give you permission? From you and your sister, I replied with a grin, prompting laughter from both girls. You can, Livia said confidently. Mom already says she likes you. Louise returned, finding us in good spirits, her hands full of plates from the buffet. Lori tugged at my arm, asking for dessert, so we went to grab some. When we returned to their house later that evening, I thanked them at the door, feeling a surprising sense of belonging. The girls rushed inside, eager to prepare for bed. I hesitated, unsure if I should linger, but Louise called out to me before I could leave. When I turned back, she stepped closer, surprising me with a kiss. It was instinctive to reciprocate, though it caught me off guard. "My daughter mentioned you were going to ask me out," Louise said, smiling shyly. Livia misunderstood. I explained. "She thought I was planning something while you were speaking to a colleague." It wasn't what it seemed. We sat on the porch steps, sharing an open, honest conversation like teenagers testing the waters of new emotions. We admitted our mutual interest, though we were cautious about what lay ahead. September was winding down, so we decided to take the girls to the town fair next Saturday and see where things went from there. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I reached my parents' farm. As soon as I walked in, Julie noticed my upbeat demeanor. "Looks like Dad had a good time," she teased. "The meeting must have been important for you to be this happy." I filled her and my parents in on the day's events. My father found it particularly amusing that Melissa had asked me to back off from Michael due to his problems. "Talk about irony," Dad chuckled. On Friday, Brenda Ferguson delivered another blow to Melissa and Michael's firm, filing a fresh lawsuit that implicated 4 senior partners and 16 women as victims of misconduct. The claims were delivered directly to the partners' homes, causing 3 of them to be barred from returning by their spouses. Brenda, relentless as ever, began probing for the name of Melissa's divorce lawyer. Meanwhile, my mother decided to do some damage of her own. She emailed several of Melissa's relatives, sharing how Melissa and Michael had been served with lawsuits and suggesting that this wasn't Melissa's first affair during her business trips. She even included details about my STD diagnosis, ensuring no stone was left unturned. The following Saturday, I was preparing to pick up Louise and the girls when Julie commented, "You're really smitten with Louise, aren't you, Dad?" I gave her a knowing look. Since the divorce began, many of the friends your mom and I shared have faded away. Louise and I connected because of our shared experiences. It's easy to trust her. I can't predict where this will go, but I'm open to the possibilities. Julie smirked. "If you need dating tips, just ask. Just promise to introduce us before it gets serious." At the fair, I learned Louise was afraid of heights, so I spent over an hour on the Ferris wheel with her daughters while Louise stayed on the ground. The girls had a blast, and their laughter was contagious. Later, we hit the food area, with Lori perched on my shoulders as we waited in line. Out of the blue, my brother Victor and his wife Mary arrived with their kids. After introductions, we all sat down to eat, the kids hitting it off immediately. Spending time with my brother's family felt surreal, given how strained our relationship had been for so long. As the kids played, Victor and Mary invited us to a family dinner on Sunday. Louise agreed, though her daughters would be with their father for the evening. Sunday was another busy day. Louise and I arrived at Victor's house around 2 p.m., with Julie and her date already there. It was a significant moment, my first time in Victor's home since he'd gotten married. Mary enthusiastically introduced Louise to everyone, and my parents quickly welcomed her with open arms. Things got interesting when Jake pulled me aside. We stepped to the edge of Victor's property, away from the others. "Dad, I messed up," Jake admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I fell for Mom's manipulation. She tricked me. Uncle Victor and my colleagues filled me in last week." "What did you learn from this?" I asked, watching him carefully. "When it comes to family," Jake began slowly, "sometimes it's best to keep your distance. No matter what you do, you might only make things worse." "You're right," I acknowledged, "but it's tough because we care so much." Jake nodded. "I see that now. Mom and I will talk someday, but not soon. Her actions, they speak louder than her words." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Look at Louise. She endured a loveless marriage until she was ready to raise her daughters alone. Her patience reflects her character. Your mother's actions have shocked your sister and me with their cruelty. Words mean nothing when actions contradict them." Jake hesitated. "Dad, here's a tough question. What else did she lie about?" I sighed. "That's something we might never know. There's no point dwelling on the past, son. All we can do is learn from it and move forward. Jake smiled faintly. Louise is impressive, Dad. The more I hear about Michael and Mom, the more I think they belong together. Julie approached, interrupting. Your conversation is drawing attention. Maybe continue this later? We're finished, Jake assured her. I just needed to apologize to Dad. As Jake walked away, Julie looked at me curiously. Just a case of saying the wrong thing, I explained. It's good to see him own up to it. Dinner was delightful. Mary captured candid moments with her camera, especially during a playful water fight that ended with me soaked. Resting in a lounge chair, I felt Lori climb into my lap, falling asleep as the adults talked. My father joined me, gesturing at Lori. This little one seems to have chosen you, he remarked. Just make sure revenge on Michael isn't your motive. I recounted how Louise and I had built a connection, starting with her first call. My father nodded approvingly. Whatever path you choose, know you have our support, he said. On Monday, a detective visited me in my office to discuss Michael Truscott. I spent an hour detailing everything I knew and provided a list of women whose spouses had discovered his affairs. Officer, I suggest you speak with Brenda Ferguson for more details, I advised. She's got the complete list. 6 weeks had passed since I learned about Melissa and Michael. The storm wasn't over, but I was weathering it well, stronger and more resolute than ever. 4 weeks had passed since Michael and Melissa's ill-fated trip. In that time, the fallout from their actions had only solidified my relationship with Louise. What began as mutual support had blossomed into something neither of us expected, though we were still navigating it with care. A detective visited me to discuss the ongoing investigations, and the conversation quickly shifted to Michael's accusations. Michael Truscott seems to have reasons for pointing the finger at you, the detective said. He's convinced you've been orchestrating these confrontations. He blames you for ruining his marriage. I chuckled darkly. Typical of him to push the blame anywhere, but where it belongs, on himself. He's incapable of accepting responsibility for his actions. The detective nodded thoughtfully. It's becoming clear he's the type who can't see past his own ego. After he left, I called Brenda Ferguson to relay the conversation. She wasn't surprised. Michael's always been a manipulator, she said. I'd bet money he's the reason I was dismissed from the firm. He probably saw me as a threat. Brenda then mentioned that Melissa had finally hired a divorce lawyer. When I got home that evening, my mother confirmed the news. She gave up after my letter, Mom said with satisfaction. Until then, Melissa had clung to the delusion that we could work things out once I calmed down. But my mother's letter had shattered any remaining hope she had. Melissa must have believed I'd orchestrated the letter as an act of revenge, but I couldn't care less about her assumptions. On Wednesday, Julie and I joined Louise and her daughters for dinner at Olive Garden. My sons, Jake and Jason, met us there. During the meal, I informed everyone that Melissa had finally hired a lawyer to handle her divorce. Louise's daughters seemed particularly enamored with Julie, showering her with questions. Julie, in turn, enjoyed their attention, and the evening felt lighthearted despite the underlying tensions. Louise and I agreed the dinner was a success. 2 months later, I found myself sitting next to Brenda in the courthouse, waiting for my hearing before Judge Donald McDonald. Across the hall sat Melissa and her lawyer, a man from her firm who seemed as smug as she was desperate. The divorce proceedings were simple. We had already agreed on the division of property. Melissa would buy out my share of the house based on its current appraisal and split our joint savings. With no mortgage or contested issues, the process was quick. When the judge called us in, we both confirmed the agreement, and just like that, the divorce was finalized. Outside the courthouse, Melissa stopped me as I headed to the parking lot. I ruined myself, she said quietly. I finally admitted my behavior to the boys. Julie still refuses to talk to me. She thinks I did all this intentionally. I just wish I'd realized sooner what kind of message I was sending. Her words rang hollow. Julie's young, I said curtly, but she can see through excuses. For an adult, what you're saying sounds superficial at best. Melissa had no response. I left her standing there, headed to my car, and didn't look back. Louise's divorce had already been finalized. She received full custody of her daughters, with Michael ordered to pay $1,000 per month in child support. $500 for each child until they turn 18, plus half of their post-secondary education costs. Their house was sold, and the profits divided equally. Michael, unable to handle the mounting confrontations from former colleagues and aggrieved spouses, had left the firm and moved to another city to start his own business. With a share of the company, he was financially secure, but his reputation was in tatters. One evening, my parents invited Louise and her daughters over for dinner. Unbeknownst to us, they had also invited Louise's parents. My parents wanted to start building a relationship with Louise's family, given how serious things were becoming between us. Brenda's negotiations with the firm's liability insurer were wrapping up. By the time the case settled, my share of the payout, after Brenda's 30% fee, was over $750,000. It wasn't just about the money, it was about sending a message to those who enabled people like Michael and Melissa. After dinner, as we all sat around the formal dining room table, used for the first time in years, I stood and pushed my chair back. Dropping to one knee, I pulled out the ring box I'd been carrying for weeks. "Louise," I said, meeting her wide-eyed gaze, "will you take a second chance on love and marry me?" For a moment, she was speechless. Then, through tears, she said, "Yes." The room erupted in cheers, and my mother immediately called Victor, Mary, and my sons to share the news. They arrived within half an hour, and the house filled with celebration. Amidst the commotion, I noticed Lori sitting quietly on the floor, tears streaming down her cheeks. I walked over and sat beside her. "What's wrong, baby?" I asked gently. "Nothing," she sniffled. "I'm just happy you're going to be my dad." Her words hit me harder than any punch ever could. I scooped her into my arms and carried her over to Louise. Tears shimmered in Louise's eyes, mirroring my own. Olivia came up beside us and asked, "Dad, when Mom and you get married, will we also take your last name?" "As soon as the court allows," I promised. My father stepped in then, his voice warm. "Olivia, Lori, from now on, you can call us grandparents." "Okay." Both girls lit up, their joy infectious. I couldn't help but think about all the time they'd get to spend on the farm, learning to ride horses and making memories with their new grandparents. Later that week, I visited Michael Truscott unannounced at his office. His secretary waved me in, and I closed the door behind me. Michael's face had mostly healed from his recent injuries, but his wary expression spoke volumes. "I think you've heard Louise and I are getting married," I began. Michael's face paled. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I need your permission, in the form of a legal document, to adopt your daughters and change their last name to mine. Olivia and Lori asked for this. This isn't just my wish, it's theirs." "Why should I agree to that?" he demanded. "Because this will get you away from me forever," I said coldly. "If you refuse, we'll meet often, and I'll make sure it's unpleasant." It took him half an hour to draft and sign the document. I left his office with exactly what I needed. Michael's secretary, a notary, certified the document on the spot. I handed the document to Louise after surprising her at school. Her eyes filled with tears as she read it. "How did you manage this?" she whispered. "Michael still believes I'm behind his injuries," I said. "I used his fear to our advantage. Now, we can make Livia and Lori's dream a reality on our wedding day." By the end of the week, Brenda had filed the necessary adoption papers, and within days, we received court approval. The girls would officially become walkers on the same day Louise and I said, "I do."